With the growing population, Africa needs to innovate in agriculture to ensure food security. The fragmentation of the continent's markets and the infrastructure deficit also pose a challenge, especially for small-scale farmers trying to access markets. Reporter Glorious Sefako-Musi spoke to Richard Lackey, the chairman of the World Food Bank, on the sidelines of the Africa Investment Forum.
There are reports that world hunger is rising and that the situation is worse in some regions in Africa. This is on the back of severe weather conditions and climate change. We're told that about 21% of the population in Africa is undernourished. Well, to take this further, we are talking to an organization that works in this space. We're joined by Richard Lackey of the World Food Bank. Thank you so much for joining us. Tell us more about the model that this organization uses to try and curb food insecurity in Africa.
Thank you. Well, the World Food Bank is a little bit unique in that it's a for-profit company, but we design a system where we come into a specific geography, even to the extent of a specific country, and we bring in everything that's needed to build an integrated agricultural value chain in that system. So in many instances, we'll come into an area and build model farms where we train local farmers, extension agents, and others, and then they in turn train the other smallhold farmers around them. At the same time, we have NGO groups and microfinance institutes that finance the inputs for those same smallhold farmers that have now been educated on the value of irrigation and the value of hybrid seeds and of using fertilizer. And if they use all of those things, we guarantee them an offtake market. So by doing that, we give them the education they need, the tools, the finance, and the marketplace.
What would you say about policy in Africa? Would you say governments are supportive of agriculture and small-scale farmers for them to grow and be able to provide food security to the continent and compete globally?
That's a really great question, because the infrastructure and the policy and all of those things are tied together. And with regard to policy, the biggest challenge that governments, the biggest challenge we have with policy is that the governments oftentimes create policy in order to do what they feel like is helping smallhold farmers, but in many times it hurts some other part of the system, some other part of the market. So one of the best things that governments can typically do is to just get out of the way, is to facilitate trade, reduce tariffs, and focus on building things like infrastructure.
What would you say are the biggest challenges for small-scale farmers in Africa?
That's a great question as well. It's a combination of things. Sometimes it's a basic education on the newest and best techniques, on what we would call best practices. The other is the access to finance to be able to buy those higher quality seeds, that better fertilizer. And to be quite frank, even with that, because of climate change and other things, a certain number of farmers every season are going to fail. And if we make them bet their entire worth on that one season, at some point they're going to lose, and it makes it very high. It makes it a very high-risk venture for them. So we have to come in with a system where we can say, look, if you use the hybrid seed, if you use good quality fertilizer and irrigation, and you follow best practices, even if you fail, we'll finance you again next year. And when you can do that year after year, you will eventually build a very strong base of farmers.
Throughout the conference, we've heard about how infrastructure deficit in Africa is constraining trade. You help farmers with market access as well. How much of a challenge is the integration of the continent in terms of policy, in terms of roads, connectivity?
Policy is one part of it, and infrastructure, as you were mentioning, is another key piece. So even if we give them market access, even if we're able to guarantee an offtake, and perhaps even export markets, we have to be able to get it to those markets. So one of the greatest things, going back to governments and going back to policy and going back to everyone that's at the Africa Investment Forum together, is to focus on infrastructure. If energy costs are too high, processors can't afford to process. If roads are not good, the cost of transport makes it so those farmers and even those aggregators are not competitive. If water is not clean, if it's not inexpensive, it's not accessible for irrigation, we have another challenge where in other markets they're more efficient. So it becomes a challenge of efficiency. The government's goal should be to improve the efficiency, the flow of money efficiency, the flow of commodities to market efficiency.
And also another issue is the fact that the food growing population is getting older and older. Is there enough being done to attract the youth to the sector?
You know, as we travel around, and we've spent a lot of time in many countries in Southeast and West Africa, there is a growing interest by youth. I think that that's drawn in part by the technologies that are coming out. But the challenge for bringing youth into the marketplace, bringing youth into active integration with agriculture, is largely what we see as finance. They need to have best practices training, and they need to have access to the dollars to be able to use those best practices and implement those technologies, to be able to see the kind of returns, and when they start making money, they'll get into agriculture.